Glad you could join us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. How much will the planet warm if humanity doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? A question that is as old as climate science itself. And a group of 25 leading scientists provided some answers recently. They concluded that catastrophic warming is almost inevitable if emissions continue at their current rate, even if there is less reason to anticipate a totally uninhabitable Earth in a coming century. They concluded that hopes that the rise in average global temperatures by 2100 might be capped below 2.5 degrees Celsius can be all but ruled out if greenhouse gas emissions continue at the current rate. Unfortunately, the increase in temperature is fueling insecurity and poverty in different parts of the world. We start the program today with a look at how this is playing out in the Kenyan Rift Valley. Do stay with us.
For more than a decade, Ikal Angeli has been fighting for the survival of Lake Turkana, the world's largest desert lake. In 2012, she won the Goldman Environmental Prize, often referred to as the Nobel Peace Prize for the Environment. She blames dwindling fish stocks on both climate change and Gibe 3, a giant hydroelectric dam built by Ethiopia on River Omo, which feeds the lake.
For a long time, we've been fighting against the destruction of Lake Turkana as a whole, not only against the Gibe 3 Dam, but also with the fisher folk in terms of fishing and how they fish, whether it's undersized fishing, issues of sanitation and various things. So we've been working with, not only as an organization, working on policy issues, but working with the communities, the fisher folk communities within the Lake Turkana.
Data from the United States Department of Agriculture showed the lake's water level dropped to 365 meters in 2006 when Gibe 3 opened, from 365 meters. Unseasonally heavy rains mean levels are back up, but the fishing community fear that is only temporary. Hundreds of thousands of people depend on the lake and the river Omo.
For a place that is very arid and very desert, you have this big water body on the northwestern part of Kenya, which borders Ethiopia. Before, the lake was actually shared with Ethiopia, but over time, the tectonic activity meant that the lake is totally in Kenya, the delta is fully in Kenya, and what is shared between Kenya and Ethiopia is the Omo River.
Fitbo Laluko's family has fished here for as long as he can remember. The shrinking lake and growing local population have made it difficult to eke out a living. He fears there will be no fish left for his grandchildren. He says boats must sail much deeper into the lake to get a good catch. The fish are also shrinking in size.
I have been fishing for the last 8 years. Our parents used to fish just like their fathers. There was a lot of Nile perch, but very few fishing boats. Now we have more people fishing and lots of fishing boats that can go out to the deep sea, no longer at the shoreline like they used to. So we are now seeing the Nile perch stocks drastically reduce. They never used to fish tilapia back in the day, but we now have many ways of fishing them now. The Nile perch feeds on the tilapia. If the tilapia stocks reduce, then the Nile perch reduces too.
In 2018, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization's World Heritage Committee added Lake Turkana to the list of endangered World Heritage Sites. Its islands are breeding grounds for the Nile crocodile, hippopotamus and several snake species. Ikal Angeli says both Kenya and Ethiopia need to share resources to make sure poor communities are not left behind.
So before you'd get a Nile perch that was the size of a human being, and now you're not seeing the size of Nile perch. So we don't know, but there's definitely room for research.
In Turkana, communal clashes have broken out over access to scarce water supplies. Ikal fears more violence should the lake drop further.
At one point you have the lake totally receding and no fish, and then at one point you have a flooding of the lake, and that means the villagers who reside near the lake have to move. So that's the one impact. The second one is the increased conflict, because when there's resources, the fish are reducing, people start to fight for it, and that it leads to people going into fishing in protected areas, into breeding zones, and creates a lot of conflict. The transboundary issue between Kenya and Ethiopia has got to be addressed by both the Kenyan and Ethiopian government. The county government of Turkana Turkana has to step in and speak for its own citizens' interests, but also the local community has to be involved in this whole process, both for conservation and economic value of the lake.
Climate change, a global pandemic, and escalating conflict is hammering the majority of countries affected by the rise in temperature and disrupting programs to alleviate the effect of desertification and erratic rainfall. An international committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent report published in July 2020 says that out of 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change, 60% are living in conflict zones. Unless urgent action is taken to mitigate the effect of global warming, the ICRC says 200 million people will need international humanitarian aid by 2050, doubling the 2018 figure. The report focused on Mali, the Central African Republic and Iraq. Nigeria too, which borders with Mali, Burkina Faso and Nigeria, where attacks are spiraling, illustrates the stress on herders who have lost land and access to water and forced thousands away from their homes in search of better grazing conditions and fleeing violence. The International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent carried out an inoculation campaign in February this year in part of Niger to help herders fight disease and maintain their cattle, but violence makes many of these regions inaccessible to those trying to change agricultural methods. The global pandemic, COVID-19, has added one more layer of danger for those distributing aid, assisting the displaced, and trying to build climate change resilience. The ICRC report says 1/3 of the world's cropland has been abandoned in the past 40 years because of erosion. Each year, an additional 20 million hectares of agricultural land either becomes too degraded for crop production or is lost to urban sprawl. It also quotes the United Nations figure that over 50% of the world's population is expected to be living in water-stressed regions by 2050.
With climate change, you know there is not enough fodder and the animals are concentrated in just one area.
As a regional head of Niger's pastoral associations, Hasimiu has spent years calling for better conditions for herding and herders in Niger. He says that the presence of armed groups in the Tillaberi region bordering Burkina Faso and Mali has drastically reduced access to pastoral land. ICRC's Alion Sumano helped to organize the inoculation in Tillaberi earlier this year.
The animals follow a pattern, predefined corridors of transhumance. But because of the current insecurity, the herders rather try to secure their cattle, and as a result, the transhumance itineraries and the animals' journey are completely disturbed.
The ICRC's policy advisor, Catherine Grayson, says climate action is urgently needed in the vulnerable zones where conflict is displacing farmers and herders.
Climate change will be felt everywhere, but its most crippling effects will be borne by the world's most vulnerable communities, and this includes those entering conflicts. Yet these communities are among those most neglected by climate action.
60-year-old Nigerian Bubakar Mukaila says grazing land in the Tillaberi region is too parched to feed his cattle, half of which he lost to disease, but conflict stops him from moving to more fertile land.
Not long ago, my children used to go as far as Azawad to graze our herd. There was good grass there. But now, we have to stay here. We're too afraid of getting attacked if we move the herd. There never used to be any security problems, and it was rare to see animals die of hunger.
The United Nations said temperatures in the Sahel are rising 1.5 times faster than the global average, and rainfall is erratic, and estimates that around 80% of the region's farmland is degraded for the average 50 million people who depend on livestock and compete for land. The UNHCR last May said 23,000 refugees fled Nigeria to Niger since April because of violence, while 19,000 Niger nationals have been displaced in their own country, fearing insecurity in border areas. Recently, France launched a coalition of West African and European allies to fight jihadi militants in the Sahel region, hoping more political cooperation and special forces will boost a military effort that has so far failed to stifle violence. Some experts say age-old tensions between farming and herding communities are intensifying because of climate change as the availability of usable land goes down and water resources become less reliable. But regardless of how much climate change might fuel the violence, what is clear is that communities' survival is that much harder when they are affected by both at once.
Armed conflict hinders those ways of coping. Herders are no longer able to move safely with their cattle. The state's capacity to provide assistance is limited, and so is humanitarian access. Herders are forced to concentrate around water points. Some have to sell their livestock at discounted prices as they cannot travel to livestock markets far away. And some who have lost everything end up moving into urban centers or greener areas. An already poor population becomes even poorer.
The ICRC says today local and international non-governmental organizations are already unable to meet humanitarian requirements. They will not be able to address the exponentially growing needs resulting from unmitigated climate change. Climate risk can lead to development reversals and systemic breakdown, particularly in fragile, conflict-affected states. They are calling for urgent action to help fight climate degradation and reach conflict zones to ensure that communities hit hardest get the support they need to adapt.
It is not an isolated issue that will quietly disappear, and it is not someone else's problem. It's about restoring and protecting the fragile layer of land which only covers a third of the earth, but can either alleviate or accelerate the double-edged crisis facing our biodiversity and our climate. That makes it the problem of anyone who wants to eat, drink, or breathe, to make their home in a town, in the country, or even in security, to use technology, medicine, or infrastructure, to have equal access to work, learning, or relaxation, simply to live.
There are even more stories about how half the people on the planet are affected by damaged land or live in urban areas consuming resources that require 200 times as much land as their towns and cities and generating 70% of emissions.
If we take action to restore our degraded land, it will save $1.3 billion a day to invest in the education, equality, and clean energy that can reduce poverty, conflicts, and environmental migration. Better land management does not hold all the answers, but it offers a stepping stone to reach our goals by 2030 and then act as a natural multiplier of their benefits.
The Sahel is one of the most environmentally degraded regions in the world, with temperature increases projected to be 1.5 times higher than the global average. It is regularly hit by droughts and floods, which have enormous consequences on people's ability to earn a living and feed their families. The region consists of 10 different countries, totaling 300 million people. Currently, 33 million women, children, and men are food insecure, while more than 4.7 million children under the age of 5 suffer from acute malnutrition.
Rising forced displacement is the symptom of such a crisis in the Sahel, especially in the West Africa part of the Sahel. Malian refugees still remaining in countries neighboring Mali have stopped returning to Mali. There was some momentum there up to a couple of years ago. The deterioration of the situation has prevented further returns. We have seen a rise in displacement in both Burkina Faso and Niger. That situation can only be responded through a more strategic combination of security and development interventions in support of governments of the region. I'd like to also flag very briefly in this context, Northeast Nigeria. There too, the momentum that we had a couple of years ago with the beginning of return of displaced people and refugees to the northeast of the country has somehow slowed down, and the region continues to be the theater of very large displacement. We owe it, I would say, to millions of ordinary Africans in villages, in towns, in cities, who out of sense of duty, out of cultural tradition, out of their own values, keep the door open, share their often scarce resources. Their solidarity, unlike in other parts of the world, is not the subject of political debate. But it would be a great mistake on our part to take that generosity for granted, because it has a very high cost and we need to share that burden.
And while better land management does not hold all the answers, it offers a stepping stone to reach global goals by 2030 and then act as a natural multiplier of their benefits. The Geneva-based World Climate Research Programme's findings show that doubling global temperature would trigger 2.6 to 4.1 degrees Celsius in average warming above pre-industrial levels, putting the lowest rise more than 1 degree above scientists' previous estimated range of 1.5 to 4.6 degrees Celsius. The study offers the first clear progress in decades towards narrowing the range of temperature rise caused by doubling of carbon dioxide levels since pre-industrial times.
So the study is a big 4-year-long assessment of how sensitive the Earth's climate is to increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what we mean by sensitive is essentially, if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, exactly how much will the Earth warm? And to put it in perspective, we're on track to double CO2 at our current rate of emissions by around 2080 or so. And so this has been a big area of uncertainty in climate science for a long time. Back in 1979, there was a big climate science report called the Charney Report, and they suggested that the range of warming you'd get if you double CO2 is somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees centigrade globally. And fast forward 35 years later, the last IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, gave the exact same range, 1.5 to 4.5. So it's proved very, very difficult for the climate science community to narrow this range, and narrowing it has sort of been seen in some ways as the holy grail of climate science. And so in this report, we provide what we think is the most thorough analysis yet that allows us to take in many different lines of evidence and actually get a better sense of exactly how much the Earth will warm as CO2 rises in the atmosphere.
The scientific consensus that the goal of capping the rise in average global temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius, as enshrined in the 2015 Paris Climate Accords, is almost certainly out of reach unless greenhouse gas emissions rates fall. Known as the climate sensitivity parameter, a doubling of carbon dioxide concentrations has been a mainstay of models for future global temperature since the late 1970s. The study, published in July in the Journal Reviews of Geophysics, rely on computer simulations using satellite observations, historic temperature records, and evidence of prehistoric temperatures from sources such as tree rings.
What we find is both the low end of the range of warming is a lot less likely, but also the high end is also a little less likely. So we can be more confident in constraining the bottom end of the range than the top end. But we find really that there is some good news and some bad news, right? The bad news is that if you were hoping that warming just wouldn't end up being much of a problem, that you'd only get 1 degree or 2 of warming if we double our emission or double our concentrations in the atmosphere, then you should be disappointed, because we found that's not very likely. But at the same time, we found that some truly catastrophic outcomes, where we get like 5 degrees or more warming, are also a lot less likely. And so we really found that climate change is about as bad as we thought it was. That the long-term best estimate of the amount of warming you get in this sort of doubling of atmospheric CO2 is pretty close to accurate.
It also confirms that the world is on course for extreme sea level rise and other severe climate impact. These effects are expected from a rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius. Already, the average global temperature has warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius.
So there's a number of climate contrarians who've argued that we don't need to worry about climate change because the Earth is probably not very sensitive to CO2. And I think this is a very strong refutation of that point. We look at 3 independent lines of evidence from sort of physical models of the climate, from historical observations of how the climate has changed, and from periods in the distant past, like the last ice age, for example. And all 3 of those give consistent estimates. And all 3 of them are pretty strong in excluding the possibility that we might end up with only a little bit of warming if we double our CO2. Now, it's really important to emphasize that we don't have to double CO2. In fact, I hope we don't. If we do nothing today and continue to emit at today's levels, we will. But we can, as a society, decide to reduce our emissions. And we've been making some progress toward that end in recent years. And so this just emphasizes even more strongly the need to reduce our emissions if we want to avoid dangerous levels of warming.
Climate scientist Andrew Dressler at Texas A&M University said he hoped the findings would spur stronger action to reduce greenhouse gases.
I think we're in a position now where we actually can rapidly ratchet down emissions if we choose to do so. That's really the question here. Do we choose to take action or not? And I think a lot will hinge on U.S. leadership and the results of this election.
Meanwhile, the World Meteorological Organization says global temperatures will continue to warm over the next 5 years and may even temporarily rise to more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That does not mean the world will be crossing the long-term warming threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which science has set as a ceiling for avoiding catastrophic climate change.
There's something like 20% probability that we would reach a year during the coming 5 years that where we would have already 1.5 degrees warmer climate than during the pre-industrial times. And it's very likely that we will see months where we reach this 1.5 degrees already. So there's 70% probability that we would reach that.
But it does show the warming trend continuing apace, underlining the enormous challenge the world faces in meeting the 2015 Paris Agreement's goal of curbing climate warming emissions enough to keep the rise in temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius.
So of course the warming of the planet continues, and so far we haven't been very successful in implementation of the Paris Agreement. The greenhouse gas concentrations, especially carbon dioxide concentration, still continues in the atmosphere, and that's the main reason for this warming. And if we would like to reach this low limit of Paris Agreement, we should really enhance the ambition level of emission controls. Especially we should reduce the use of fossil energy, oil, gas and coal during the coming 20 years to be successful in reaching this low limit of Paris Agreement. So we have seen more than double the global warming in the Arctic, and that's going to continue. Then these tropical zones will face lower temperature changes than the global average, and then we estimate that there will be also changes in precipitation patterns for the coming 5 years, and for example, South America and Australia and some parts of Africa would face more severe drought during the coming 5 years, and there's an estimation that in Western Europe we would see more often storms than we have seen in the past. So this COVID era is, of course, it's also an experiment from atmospheric perspective, and we estimate to see something like 4 to 7% drop of the carbon dioxide emissions this year because of the lockdowns. But since the lifetime of carbon dioxide is so long, it doesn't have an impact on the concentrations in the atmosphere. So there may be a little bit of slowdown of the emission growth, but it doesn't change the big picture.
Europe should see more storms, while North Atlantic will be windier. The projections are part of a new World Meteorological Organization's effort to provide shorter range forecasts of temperature, rainfall and wind patterns to help nations keep tabs on how climate change may be disrupting weather patterns.
That's our program for the week. Thank you for spending your time with us. Please do check us out online. youtube.com/channelsweb is our channel. Do click the playlist menu and then Earthfile for this video and others of the program. From all of us here in Lagos, it's bye for now.